Hey there friends, what's going on? It's Codiak here, back for another Assassin's Creed Valhalla video. And today, I wanted to take a snapshot of the game. I thought it was a good time to take a look back at Assassin's Creed Valhalla as a whole, talk about some of the things that went right, some of the things that went wrong, and share my thoughts on some of the biggest systems in the game and how they could potentially influence the future of the series. I want to start this video off with the positive things, because ultimately, I did enjoy Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and I continue to. Even though the endgame loop isn't quite established yet, maybe it will with New Game Plus, I really don't think there's going to be a great endgame loop, but I do enjoy the game as a whole, which is why I want to start with some of the positive things. The first thing I want to talk about is side quest content, or as we know them in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, mysteries. I think this is one of the best additions to the game, and I really felt like these things enriched the world. You had really quirky, really fun side content that wasn't necessarily a challenge, but it was a different approach to side content as we know as RPG players. I think it presented players with a unique take on gameplay systems. It wasn't the same thing over and over again, and ultimately it wasn't tedious, and it really didn't require you to ever go too far, which I think is the perfect balance for side quest content. The content helped progress you in terms of your power level, it gave you a welcome break from the main story and the main narrative, it injected some humor and kind of quirkiness, and I really do think this is some of the best side quest content Ubisoft in any RPG has ever established. It's not incredibly deep, so you're not going to get those really impactful moments like you would in a game like The Witcher 3, but overall, I think the side quest content or mysteries worked incredibly well in the game. One of the other things I think worked incredibly well in the game were settlements, and this is a step in the right direction and a good reintroduction of a base building component in Assassin's Creed. I enjoyed the evolution alongside the main adventure. I think that was really the takeaway from the settlement. As I was progressing in the game, I was also progressing my settlement, and it felt like those two things were in parallel almost the entire time. Now, you could forget about your settlement for the most part and not upgrade things, not establish new buildings, things like that, but you really could just take a few minutes, establish your settlement, get some benefits from it, and I really like that. I think it is exactly what the devs intended for that bit of content. It was also cool that key moments from the story and other parts of the narrative actually happened at the settlement, which made it feel more like a living, breathing thing. I did think that the settlement felt alive, and oftentimes I was coming back there just to hang out for a few minutes or just collect my thoughts, and that's exactly how I think it was intended to be used. And adding those story elements, whether it be main story or side quest story or color story, really made it feel like the settlement was valuable and important. Now, on the flip side, I think a lot of people would say it's a bit simplistic, it needed more customization. Even though you could throw down some unique decorations around the settlement, you couldn't change the layout. There was really no uniqueness in the settlement. It was kind of exactly how Ubisoft intended it, and while that's kind of by design, it did suffer for that reason. Again, simplicity is good, but not when you're trying to create your own identity for players in a game. And I think that's where they could have pushed a little bit harder to make settlements feel like your settlement as opposed to Ubisoft's settlement that you're living in. But overall, I think it was a step in the right direction, and settlements for me was a big thumbs up. This next one is going to be a little contentious, but bear with me. I do believe that the intentionally designed items was fantastic. It was a great way to integrate items into the game that matter. Oftentimes with RNG-based loot, things get added into the game and you just end up not caring about it, and you have kind of the Borderlands effect where there's so many things being thrown at you that none of it matters. If you have a million crazy guns or a million crazy swords, does any of them really stand out? Probably not. But if you have intentional items that basically remove the element of RNG, the developers have more direct control over the rewards that you get, and they can make that balance more meaningful. By not throwing a million things at players, it made you actually feel like you were getting a reward. And even though getting some of those rewards were basic and simplistic, you did actually feel like you were getting something valuable. I also like that because of this custom design, there was very little overlap and recycled features, and all of the different weapon types gave the developers the flexibility to create special effects on certain weapon types, which made every item feel unique. Now, I will admit the loot system in the game is not perfect. I will be the first to admit that. Some people in the community felt like there just wasn't enough and they were missing that random experience, and I kind of agree with that. I do think they could have gone a little bit more in terms of throwing more items at players. But again, with custom items, there has to be a custom artist and a custom developer that is creating these things, as opposed to in an RNG system where they just have to kind of create the tumbler that spits out these different items. Overall, I'm not incredibly upset about this, but I do think that they missed a lot of opportunities to integrate more gear into the game, specifically because a lot of the items are locked behind a paywall, but we'll talk about that when we get to the what went wrong section, as you can imagine. Ultimately, this one is going to come down to personal preference. I personally liked it because it allowed for straightforward build design and really allowed you to tailor the items that were custom created to players that will get a lot of use out of it, not having to hunt down different RNG components like perks or enchantments, anything like that. But I will admit it did lack the variety that you get with an RNG kind of loot crazy game. So it's a double-edged sword here. I've seen a lot of comments of people loving it. I've seen a lot of comments of people hating it. So this one really does come down to personal preference. Another big win for me was the dual wielding system in the game. This was a big selling point before the launch of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. It was a fantastic change to the combat system, allowed a lot of flexibility, and it fit the more action-oriented nature of the game, whether you like that or not. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a more action-centric game, and while you could play it from a stealth component, the dual-wield system really didn't influence that in any way. The dual-wield system was designed for that action experience and allowed players that flexibility to enjoy the combat and experiment the way they wanted, and ultimately, I think this was an absolutely essential and fantastic addition to the game. Since we're talking about dual wielding and player flexibility, let's talk about the combat, which I also think was a really big win for the team. It felt impactful, and most of the time I thought the combat was responsive. There was a learning curve, and there was a little bit of a sluggishness to it at the start, but once you get used to that, especially when you're using some of the heavier weapons, it really was a fun experience top to bottom. There was also a combat style for everyone, whether it was up close and personal or far away. There was always something that you could tap into and make work. Again, the variety wasn't always there because of the custom designed items, but it did allow players to experience the game exactly how they wanted. I also think the abilities in the game were well designed for the most part, outside of a few bugs and balancing issues, but I will admit that not all of the abilities were created equal. There were some that were just clearly better than others, but there was enough in the game to fit most playstyles, and those abilities were flashy. They felt special, and while they probably could have done more, I think there was a nice balance of what players want, what players expect, and giving you a bang for your buck when it comes to the actual abilities in the game. Now, over the past few months, there has been a lot of talk about the combat being way too action-centric and not enough stealth-centric, but I will argue that there was plenty of flexibility to allow players to experience the game however they wanted. If they wanted to go all stealth, you could do that. If you wanted to go all action, you could do that too. I think they opened the door for that flexibility, and while it does give you sometimes a more vanilla experience, you get the flexibility to play exactly the way you want. Those abilities, that flexibility allowed you to take on some of the most enjoyable boss fights I've done in a game in quite some time, and while not everyone was perfect, bosses like Folke really surprised me and were just a great addition to the game. There were others like the Builder in Asgard that I know frustrated a lot of people, but I think that had more to do with the power scaling issue than anything else. Not everyone was designed perfect, I will say that, but I think for the most part, the bosses in the game get a huge thumbs up. Now, of course, there is more we could talk about, like the main story or the Order of the Ancients, but those 5 things really stuck out to me and I felt took the game to the next level. As always, we want to hear from you guys. What do you think went right in Assassin's Creed Valhalla? Feel free to share your comments in the section below. You know I do my best to read through as many as I can every night, and I would love to see what aspects of Assassin's Creed Valhalla you think the Ubisoft team did well. All right, let's move on to some of the things that I think went wrong with Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and of course, top of that list is the game-breaking bugs since day one. This is a huge problem for me. It's been a huge problem for a long time, and I've been pretty vocal about it in all of the videos. I think the issues with the Order of the Ancients, people not being able to finish that after months of this game being released, is a huge problem. I think the key quests being choke points for players, not able to interact with NPCs, not being able to get past these choke points, again, another big issue. If players can't get past a certain point in the game, what are they going to do? They're going to walk away from it. They're going to put it down and they're most likely never going to come back. And this should have been a red flag for Ubisoft and fixed within the first few weeks of players experiencing these things. I also think that the bugs with the Yule Festival were absolutely abhorrent. This was the first bit of content added to the game, and it introduced so many new bugs, and it was just a real big disappointment. I also think the issues with Retta's shop, not being able to interact with him, not being able to get those opals is an issue considering that's the only endgame loop within Assassin's Creed Valhalla at this point. So huge miss there. They should have fixed that as soon as possible. And a little bit more of an immersion breaking one was the Mary Lude bug. You guys know that I had that for quite some time, where you could only use that cloak from Gloucestershire, and it was just a silly thing that should have been fixed. I'm glad that they did eventually, but ultimately, and looking at this snapshot, bugs were one of the biggest issues with Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I guarantee you it's a big reason why players stopped enjoying the game, and a reason why a lot of players put it down. Now, another thing I think went wrong, and we've talked about this a lot on the channel, is the over-monetization of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. The best items being locked behind paywalls being the numero uno issue. There is a FOMO effect here in full swing. If you couldn't get that item, you are like missing out on something and you needed to spend money to get it. Now, of course, this isn't a multiplayer game, so that effect isn't as amplified as it is in a game like Destiny, but it's still in effect and it's still a very predatory practice. Now, we did spend some time talking about the 8 standard sets of gear in the game and the 8 paid sets of gear in the game in another video, so I won't harp on it, but ultimately we know that greed is becoming an issue with Ubisoft, and they're not showing any signs of slowing down, and they're definitely not showing any signs that things are going to change. So this is a big issue. I think we need to keep talking about it, keep making sure that Ubisoft knows we're not cool with this, and hopefully, fingers crossed, things will change somewhere down the road. The third thing I want to talk about is Asgard, and I really just feel like this was a missed opportunity overall. The mythos and mythology of Assassin's Creed is often interwoven with the game, and I really feel like Asgard was a parallel experience that, yes, it informed the lore and kind of what was going on in the story, but as a payoff to gameplay and players, it really didn't provide anything. Loot was non-existent. The Tears of Ymir thing was just absolutely ridiculous, and for the payoff of that to be a few skill points, and we'll talk about the skill system in a little bit because you know it was pretty much useless, it really was a letdown. There were such great opportunities to inject loot into Asgard, give players a reason to go into Asgard, to explore the world, and ultimately, none of that happened. It was a great way to connect the story elements, sure, but overall it just missed the mark way too often for something I think everybody was looking forward to. You put 20 community members in a room and say, pitch me your best Asgard ideas, whether it be, god favors or extra mini games. I think you could have come up with a ton of additional content that players could have been a lot more excited about, but what we ended up getting was incredibly vanilla. The art, the atmosphere, that was all perfect, but overall the gameplay that was supposed to back that up just never really amounted to anything, and it ultimately made Asgard feel like an empty kind of waste of time. In that same vein of boringness, I kind of want to talk about raiding. It's a great concept, of course it's very Viking themed, but the execution was incredibly boring. It needed some sort of X factor, and while the diversity of the enemies did help, it didn't solve the staleness issue. Sure, we did a ton of raids, but I can't honestly remember any of them because ultimately it all felt like the same thing. I did think the diversity of the buildings and the forts and the castles was kind of cool, but the actual gameplay going in, blowing up everybody, and leaving was kind of, I don't know, lame. One of the things they could have done to solve this was having more interactions with your Vikings. You call in your entire war raid party, and all they do is just auto-attack and help you open doors. There should have been a deeper system there that allowed you to interact with various Vikings, maybe set up moves, some sort of duality to all of it that made you feel like calling in your Vikings was a meaningful thing. You also couldn't pillage the way that Vikings actually pillage these places. While it's not a big sticking point, I know a lot of people in the community were upset with that, and ultimately the rewards just never seem that satisfying. You always open the same gold-looking chest for some kind of amalgamous resource that you used in your settlement, and it really never felt like you were getting the payoff those big types of raids deserved. The final thing I want to talk about in the scope of this video is the skill tree system. Man, what an absolute waste of time. It was just a point dump, and if you've gotten to the end game of Assassin's Creed Valhalla, you know this. It allowed you to outscale everything, which ultimately led to a difficulty problem in the game. If you got all the points, the rest of the game was kind of a cakewalk and you could just steamroll everything even at the hardest difficulty. There was no build potential since you could unlock everything, and although it was nice that you could respec at any time and that was perfect for leveling, they needed to commit to this system to make it unique, but they ultimately made it so accessible that it's useless. I was really disappointed with this, especially after playing games like Path of Exiles and Wolcen, which give you such flexibility to create unique builds. This system was just a mess with no real payoff. Eventually, once players realized they were just going to be able to fill out the entire tree, you stopped caring about what things you were putting points in because eventually you were going to get it all. Sure, you picked those major nodes first, the things that you wanted, maybe it was dual wield weapons or advanced assassinations, but ultimately you knew you were going to get it all, and it was so easy to level up that the skill tree system was just nothing. It just was nothing, a big bucket of points, and ultimately a completely wasted system, just a way for Ubisoft to keep you in line with the content in terms of power level. Of course, there's more we could talk about on both sides, things that went well, things that didn't go well, but I didn't want to drag this video on for too long. I wanted to focus on the things that I thought really shined and really didn't shine. Again, if you want to share your thoughts about either the things that went right or the things that went wrong, feel free to leave your comments in the section below. And as always, if you want more Assassin's Creed content in your feed, don't forget to hit that like and of course subscribe to the channel. It really does help us out a ton and it's completely free for you. If you want to follow Legacy Gaming even more, definitely check out our Discord link in the section below. We do community giveaways and we're closing in on 6,000 members, so join up today and be part of the Legacy family. My name is Codiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching and play on.